About 1870, a doctor that lived in Marshfield, Missouri, Dr. Bradford, went to New Orleans. And while he was there, he noticed a boatload of parrots being brought in. And he thought his wife would really like to have one because most families that were well-to-do had parrots. And his wife didn't have one, so he thought, I'll do that for my wife and take her a parrot. So he bought Polly and took her home, and the family just absolutely loved her. She just became one of the family. And they began to teach her to talk. And they found out that while she was in Cuba, she'd already learned to talk some words, and they didn't speak Spanish, but some other people did, and they were telling the Bradfords that the language that she was speaking wasn't very ladylike. And so they had to try to teach her not to say Spanish words, but to speak in English. So one day they had a Brush Arbor meeting in Marshfield, and they took Polly to the Brush Arbor meeting because it was going to last a day or two, and they took Polly's cage, and Polly was quite a singer, and when the people started singing, she would start singing louder than they sang, and when the preacher started preaching, she would talk louder than the preacher. And finally the preacher told Mrs. Bradford, you're going to have to do something with that parrot because she's disturbing the service. And so Mrs. Bradford took the parrot and her cage out a distance from the Brush Arbor meeting and covered it with a sheet, and so Polly was quiet after that. And in the late 1870s, Barnum and Bailey Circus came to Marshfield, and as they were parading down in front of the Bradford home, Polly was out in her cage on the front porch, and she'd never seen elephants and camels and tigers before, and she got so excited and got to talking ugly in Spanish, and the circus owner immediately got her attention, and he went to Mrs. Bradford and he said, Lady, I will give you $25 for that parrot. And she said, no, I couldn't take $25 for Polly. And Polly just kept talking, and he said, I'll give you $50 for the parrot. And she said, no, she couldn't sell Polly for $50. And he finally said, Lady, I'll give you $100 for that bird. And she said, it'd be just like selling one of my children. Polly's just like one of the family, and I couldn't possibly part with her. So in 1880, what they called or referred to as the Cyclone of Marshfield hit. A terrible tornado hit Marshfield, and it blew almost every home away and killed about 100 people. And Mr. Bradford and the son Sidney was killed in this terrible tornado, and it blew the house away. And after the storm passed, those that survived, went to see if anyone needed any help. And they heard what they thought was a baby crying. It was, Mama, oh Mama. And it was Polly, and she was near Dr. Bradford, and he was not responding, and they found that he was dead. And they finally located Mrs. Bradford. She'd been blown out in the field, and she was so badly bruised that she was almost beyond recognition. But Polly knew her, and she was comforted. But after that, she just kept saying, Hey, Ma, where's Paul? Where's Buddy? That's what she called Sidney. And this really disturbed Mrs. Bradford. And finally, she decided to send Polly to West Plains to her daughter, who was married to Thomas Jefferson Langston, who owned the Langston Mercantile in West Plains. And after that, Polly was so afraid of storms that every time she heard thunder, she would begin to cry out and just have a fit, and they'd have to get a heavy quilt and cover Polly's cage so that she couldn't hear the thunder so much, and she was comforted that way. Polly, when she was a teenager, had been taught to sing, and mostly they was teaching her hymns, and she had a favorite hymn that was called How Firm the Foundation, and she would sing quite frequently. And when she sang, she insisted that someone in the family go to the piano and play for her, and if they didn't, she just absolutely had a fit. Now, Mrs. Langston was host to the Ladies' Aid Society, and they met at her house regularly. And as Polly was always there, and she would hear the ladies talking, and after they would leave, Polly would have a conversation with herself, and she would say, "Well, goodbye, Mrs. Smith. It was awfully nice having you. Oh, the cream was delicious, and do come again." And oh yes, thank you. And so she would just go on that way. She had heard Mrs. Bradford call her husband many mornings and say, "Hey Jeff, it's time to get up. Time to wash your face and comb your hair. You got to shave and go to work." And Polly heard this so often that she started doing that. So every morning her job was to call Mr. Thomas Jefferson Langston and tell him it's time to get up. And so Polly was just so loved by the family, but not only was she really liked by the family, but everyone in West Plains loved her because the Langston family lived on what is now Langston Street across from the Robinson Drago Funeral Home, and she spent a lot of time out on the front porch in her cage and would take time to talk to people as they would pass by. So she became really popular all over in Howell County and was much respected and loved by the citizens of our area. She was born or hatched in 1867, and in 1920, almost 53 years later, she died. And the family loved her so much they couldn't think of anything but to take her to Oaklawn Cemetery and bury her in the Langston burial plot. And Polly has her own tombstone that says Polly, 1867, 1920.
And so she was a native of Cuba.
Yes. They brought her over on a boatload of Polly's parrots from Cuba. That's where she got her Spanish. And she'd heard men cussing over there, and she just cussed. Somebody's fooling with her. I think I found another thing I didn't realize I had about her, and she was 3 years old when they got her. So that was in about 1870.
What fun!
Yeah,
What
wouldn't that
fun.
be great to have someone like that?